U.S. intelligence agency mind control.
I've got stuff about him.
Never been more guilty.
To provide Palestinians an enhanced membership in the UN, enhanced from where they're at. At this point, they have a sort of an observational membership to the UN. They don't have a vote. This vote at the UN Assembly was to basically enhance the rights that the Palestinians had in the context of the UN. It is the General Assembly, so it does not have the binding force of the UN that something passing through the Security Council does, but it does increase pressure on the Security Council. It does create some type of political pressure. Here is the United Nations Israel rep, Jalad Erdan, speaking out against this new resolution, and he's brought props. I don't know if everybody was handed a smock beforehand.
That's not in this clip, but
we don't have that?
Well, we do have it. We can do both, but this is a separate
His
part.
remarks prior, and then
All right, let's hear the remarks, and then we'll look at the props.
Thank you, Mr. President. Over 85 years ago, as World War II began, a force of sheer evil rose up with the goal of dominating the planet through genocide and destruction. After Hitler's rise to power, the Nazis sought to subjugate humanity under their iron fist while annihilating the Jewish people, but not only us, all those who they deemed subhuman. But in the face of this genocidal plot, the forces of good came together in order to end this horror, to return freedom and peace to the world. And following the Allies' victory, this institution here, the United Nations, was founded with the mission of ensuring such tyranny never raises its ugly head.
And you know what else they did? They made the UN Convention on the Punishment and Prevention of the Crime of Genocide, which you are breaching 4 of the 5 conventions, you fuckwits. Eat shit and die.
Again, never. Today,
also,
you're about to do the exact opposite and advance the establishment of a Palestinian terror state, which will be led by the Hitler of our times.
Oh, yeah.
The Hitler of our times.
Netanyahu?
In the 1940s, the world united to destroy.
I mean, this is such
disgusting.
Well, it's such an assault on history, on reality.
If anyone was the Hitler of our time, it was Saddam.
Yes.
Or Assad. Assad's pretty bad too. But Assad is more power hungry. Saddam is just...
He was just bloodthirsty.
Well, he definitely wanted to rule the Arab world and stuff.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah. He was King Arab, yeah.
You know what Hitler also did?
Although Gaddafi kind of wanted to be King of Africa too.
Yeah, Putin's bad too, but...
Yeah. I would argue Xi. If we're really...
Putin and Xi, they're all too reserved. You know? They get enough slap on the wrist to continue getting by.
Yeah, he was very outward and charismatic. I'm talking more actions. Like actions-wise, like methodology, maybe not so much. Even with China, maybe yes. But like China has their own Aryan race. They've got ultranationalism. It's an ethno state. They're committing genocide with concentration camps. They are trying to control the world, theoretically. At least they're dissidents. They do have tentacles and tendrils and fucking arms in other countries.
The unique thing about the Holocaust, though, is the Protocols of Elder Zion conspiracy that Hitler believed. That they should have won the last war, but Jews undermined the state. That's something you don't necessarily have.
In China, no. Which is why...
In anywhere, you know?
No.
Well, Turkey's not killing Kurds because they're undermining the state. You could say that kind of happened with Saddam, but it was because some Kurds were working with Iran and some were working with Iraq. Yeah. So there's like they're actually fighting. You know, that's like you know, it wasn't like innocent civilians like he did kill civilians, obviously, but you know, it's not like the night of broken glass.
Yeah. Like it's really hard to, and this is why comparing the Nazis to things as a
the
general
Armenian genocide
idea
was
is
like
easier. That was before him.
But like the specific rhetoric of this is, you see that in Israel now, the specific rhetoric of this was caused by the foreign enemy amongst us.
True.
That's
it's very Nazi-esque, isn't it?
That's scary rhetoric.
Or also the rhetoric of like they're fighters in civilian clothing. It's justifying the massacres. It's justifying the murdering of civilians. Because it's like, well, they could be a Hamas fighter. So it's like, you know, maybe you should look in a mirror.
But
realistically, we should like that thought experiment that we just did should not be done. It's silly. It distracts from the point, and it is completely unnecessary. But for the purposes of proving that what they're doing is kind of exactly that, we did that thought experiment. Cringe.
He said to European countries, "Look, you're not taking any of these refugees that we're
worms in your brain, honestly.
So we're going to have to do something to deal with them."
Yeah.
Why aren't you taking them?
You could call it voluntary displacement.
Countries. You're all white countries. Why aren't you taking some of your fellow Caucasians? The idea that Hamas has
a murder.
But by God, let's hope he's not. Let's force him not to be, even, you know, because then we would, learning a lesson of from the Holocaust is saying never again for anybody.
Exactly.
Keep going.
Let's
Destroy
play out.
A murderous regime. Yet today, with sick and twisted irony, the very body established to prevent evil is now welcoming a terror state into its ranks. What would Churchill say if he were alive today? What would Roosevelt think? They are.
Churchill would separate the country by race. Separate the UN room by race. He would employ Australia to reject Japan from the League of Nations because they're Asian. That's what they would do. That's not a good person to invoke.
Turning in their graves. This week, only this week.
Yeah, they're turning in their graves because non-white people are in the UN, you clown.
Israel commemorated Yom HaShoah.
Things, right? So the times I've heard that type of language, like we're undermined by like something that needs to be wiped out.
Yeah.
Zarqawi and ISIS was like that with Shia, right? And not so much the Taliban today, but the initial Taliban was like that with the Hazara, because historically the Hazara, because they were an oppressed Shia minority, historically they would side with the foreign governments, right?
Interesting.
Because the foreign governments offered them protection, which only led into the stereotype that they're, you know, they're always the traitors of the country.
They're feeding their own delusions because they're being so aggressive against them.
Like
and
these
therefore
sentiments still exist in
driving them
Iraq
away.
today, but also like there was just a civil war.
Yeah.
So it's not exactly the same thing, but it's gotten close.
Holocaust Remembrance Day. And it is during our sacred week that this
like I'm being like semi facetious, like I'm kind of being serious where it's like they have all this stuff, but again, like as well, like his rhetoric, I'm not 100% certain how aggressive it is. Probably hit up Sino Talk. He's probably the best one to ask. That's who I'd ask.
Shameless body has chosen to reward modern day Nazis with rights and privileges. As Israelis mourn the Jewish babies burned in the crematoria, you here at the UN usher in the collaborators of the Israeli babies burned on October.
What about all the Palestinian kids blown to pieces by Israeli bombs? You psychotic fascist fuck.
7th. How can you be so blind? Is it your political interest? Are these your distorted values? Are you being threatened by diplomatic terror of the Palestinians and their collaborators?
Whatever the fuck you want.
There are
At
many
this
here.
point, I don't give a shit.
I mean,
I'm
him
fucking better
saying
than
you
you.
want to give Nazis rights? You want to give Nazis rights? He's referring to every Palestinian as Nazis there. And this is in keeping with the story just still. It's just people should know this. Netanyahu has said that Hitler got the idea for exterminating the Jews from the Palestinian Grand Mufti. That is a conspiracy theory. It is a lie. But it's a way to demonize the people that they're subjugating and dehumanize them. And this was the moment that we were referring to earlier, Sam, with the prop, where he brought a paper shredder out.
So today, I will hold up a mirror for you.
There's no way. There's no way he actually believes that.
What?
There's no fucking way.
What? Believe what?
Hold on.
Churchill did hate the Jews. Churchill also fucking was one of the many people who have inflicted the pains that Bangladesh still feels today.
Oh my god, it's fucking real.
What? The Grand Mufti thing
Oh
with
my God,
Netanyahu?
it's fucking real.
The Grand Mufti thing with Netanyahu?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah,
Oh
that's
my
what
God,
I
it's
say it
real.
all the
Oh
time.
my
I say it all
God.
the time. Bibi says,
retarded.
Bibi said that the Mufti told Hitler, if you expel the Jews, you'll send them here. He said, Hitler was a nice guy, actually. He didn't want to kill us all originally. He was only going to send us to Israel. He's literally a Holocaust revisionist, yeah.
That's fucking hysterical.
This is your mirror. So that you can see exactly what you are inflicting upon the UN Charter with this destructive vote. This is...
Is that the UN
You are
Charter?
shredding the UN Charter
small, I think.
with your own...
Is this
I don't know.
It's got to be like a spy thing to specifically shred documents and IDs and stuff, right? What else? Checks?
Yeah, maybe.
That's probably what it's for, is checks.
A check shredder, yeah.
And
Oh, there it is. No,
yes,
it's like you're doing it.
that's what you're doing. Shredding the UN Charter.
Okay.
Shame on you. Thank you, Mr. President.
I don't know. Didn't have the impact I thought it would. I feel like you might have just gotten away with saying you're shredding the charter. You're literally shredding it. Not let me bring out the smallest possible version of a shredding machine and the smallest possible version of the UN Charter and do it.
And do that, and it's like pathetic little whirring as if it's doing anything. It sounds like a child's toy winding up. But anyway, I'm gonna bring out whatever. The point is just this is just in crazy propaganda, crazy, insane.
Flockhart on the IM says,
if you look up what the Grand Mufti looks like, that's one of those profile pictures that you'll see online where it's caution, psychopath probably behind this account.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. That's a big one. Here's another one. I sent it to Ace and we were talking about it. I don't remember what it was.
what is this? A charter for ants?
Yep. Yeah. Man. I know. And when he says how can you be so blind? It's just I mean,
there's a quality
yourself.
of sometimes you walk into a sort of a room and you're like, man, everybody here is crazy.
yes.
Everybody, every single person here is crazy. I'm the only sane person. It's so crazy that out of 100 people in this room, I'm the only sane one.
It's so odd. It's like that friend that you have that is constantly in relationship dramas. And they're breaking up with people and they can't maintain a relationship. And you're like, okay, well, maybe just look a little bit inward. I don't know. It could be helpful. It could be helpful.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Here's Morgan.
Yes, it's Piers Morgan speaking with Israeli spokesperson Avi Hyman, just asking about the number of civilian casualties in Gaza and whether there's a specific number that the Israeli government is relying upon. Let me just cue that up really quickly.
Yeah, and I guess I haven't seen this yet.
A genocide
perception's going.
Piers, we're fighting against Hamas a genocidal terror organization. I've seen your coverage, your tremendous coverage of what Hamas did to us on October 7th. You and I know they want to do it again and again and again. That's their words, not mine. Now, we'll do what we have to do to go after Hamas, to avoid civilian casualties, something that we have successfully done. Out of that Hamas number that you just gave, more than 14,000 are terrorists that we took out. There's more than 25,000 Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorists.
How many civilians do you believe you've killed?
We don't have exact figures, as you know, it's the fog of war.
Well, you've got exact numbers for Hamas terrorists you've killed. Why wouldn't you know how many civilians you've killed?
Because obviously our focus is to go after the Hamas terrorists. And
that does imply that you're putting...
Pierce is onto something. But it's funny because like the PSLers are like being like, Pierce is the #1 like Israeli simp here. And it's like, come on, guys. Have you seen he literally platforms Breakthrough News and you're gonna do him like that? Like, come on. You guys have no loyalty. Can't trust PSLs.
Mm-hmm.
A bigger premium on killing Hamas terrorists in terms of numbers and accountability than you are on innocent civilians. That can't be right, surely. If you know exactly how many Hamas terrorists you've killed, you must know how many civilians you've killed. Otherwise, you're prioritizing the lives of terrorists over innocent people.
Piers, with respect, don't put words into my mouth, please. I didn't say exactly 14,000. I said around 14,000. Whereas Hamas will come out with precise numbers that statisticians
Give me
will
a
look at.
ballpark number for civilians.
Well, you can use the ballpark as far as the Hamas figures, which I reject as being false.
Well, if they're false, why would you give me those?
I gave you the numbers that I had.
No, you told me you know how many Hamas terrorists you've killed, but you don't have any idea how many civilians you've killed. I'm just bemused. Why wouldn't you keep count of both?
I don't have that information to give you, Piers. If I did, I would.
You have literally no idea how many civilians you've been killing.
I can tell you definitively that our aim is to go after Hamas.
I'm sorry to push you on this. That's quite extraordinary. You're an official spokesman for the Israeli government, and you have no idea how many civilians you've killed.
What? Pierce literally goes, look, I'm sorry, but I really gotta push this. He literally apologized.
British moment.
I thought you just told me that you were particularly careful about not killing civilians. But if you don't know how many you've killed, how can you say that with any certainty?
Because even if you were to go by a ratio of the Hamas figures, we would still...
And it would be like the perfect thing to do a cringe, like, meme where the glasses come down and you have the cigarette, like they're cool. Yeah. Like owned. If he just goes, how many civilians have you killed? He just goes 0. Like
it would be funny.
It would be so cringe. You'd
be
see
far
that
ahead of.
Yes.
That wasn't my question. You know it wasn't my question.
I don't have the information.
You literally have no idea how many civilians you've killed.
It's not that I don't know. I'm not authorized to give the information. I don't have the information.
That's complete nonsense. Why are you authorized to give me the number of terrorists you've killed and not a number of civilians? I don't understand.
Oh my God.
Can you explain?
Piers, we will go after Hamas. We will ensure that we...
you want me to believe you're being incredibly careful about how many civilians you're killing. And you have an amazing exemplary record
as well, where they just stopped talking when Piers was asking questions.
Were they Israeli spokesperson as well?
I don't know. It's just triggering something in my brain.
That's so... Children. Literal children. Spoiled children. As you were, it might have been before the stream. You were fucking mocking them with like daddy's credit card.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it was. It's exactly what this is. They're just a rich girl and getting angry because daddy cut off her credit card. That's literally what this is.
Record, but you don't know how many civilians you're killing. So how do I know you've been careful?
Piers, when the dust settles, we will come out with the proper numbers. Hamas runs to the press daily.
But when the dust settles, a lot of people will have died. And you know how many Hamas you've killed, but you don't know how many civilians you've killed. And I'm just asking you why. Why is it you've kept a record of one, but not the other?
I personally don't have that information to give to you. You can ask me over and over. I'm not going to come up with more information. I don't.
He's a spokesperson. You should have this information.
I mean, he did answer the question technically.
You don't know.
I don't have the information for you.
Well, you're an official government spokesperson.
But how do you get numbers of fighters but not civilians?
He said the answer to the question was, he said it once, that he said specifically, I'm not authorized to give that information, but I do know it.
So he does know the number.
Yes, he's just not authorized to say it.
Right.
For the Israeli government, and you have no idea.
I came on here to focus on what's going on with the war.
That's what came on here to answer my question.
Why don't you go by the Hamas numbers, which we dispute? Which was the Hamas numbers are accurate. That's literally what he said,
I think.
Yeah, and I don't have an answer for you to that.
And I didn't intend to press you on this point because I assumed that you would not respond the way you have. But I've never had an Israeli spokesman who simply said, I have no idea. Particularly after you posted about the fact that you've been very smart in the way you've avoided killing civilians. How do you know?
Because, you know, like I'll keep up like maybe the first like week to 2 weeks to 3 weeks when a conflict really breaks out. But like seeing all the media being posted and like just doing like general estimates, like I kept like getting within the ballpark of what the Hamas ministry would say on the daily.
Oh, really?
Give or take like a few thousand, you know?
I mean, it's pretty good good place to be like, well, I got this same number or similar number, so I'd say that this is a pretty good method. You know, and if there's a third number that comes out that's kind of around the same again, then you've got corroboration, and now you've got confirmation that your method is pretty good. So, you know,
got no idea how many you've killed.
Because I know the way in which the IDF operates. I know the way in which we go after the terrorists in the best possible way. It's not what I've said. It's what General Petraeus has said. It's what John Spencer from West Point has said.
No, you fucker. How dare you say that what you're doing is what General Petraeus would do? How fucking dare you say that? First of all, you should be doing what General Petraeus' strategy was, but it's too late for that. There is no way that you can win. There's no amount of dollars you can fucking shell out to tribal families in Gaza to make them work with you. It's just not going to happen. Like, no. The hearts and minds strategy of Petraeus, like Petraeus literally, the new manual for counterterrorism is authored by him.
Well, really?
Yes. As far as like when we talk about tactics against modern terrorism, like he's one of the definitive sources. Israel is not doing what he did. He also fucking killed bin Laden.
It's what multiple British generals have said.
Can we pause it for a sec? Because that is such a so many revealing things. Great job, Piers Morgan. I mean, he got that. He did not relent. When he says because it's basically because we're intrinsically moral, right? Like we are intrinsically the victims, and that's why we can make this case. We are the victims, so you have to believe us, as opposed to having to demonstrate any of that. And when he says that we know what the ratio is between Hamas fighters that we've killed and civilians, and how we're the most moral army in the world and we're being more careful than anybody, I'm not a math person. Infamously,
I'm sure Petraeus.
How do you calculate a ratio, Sam?
I mean, he's a Zionist, of course, because he's a U.S. general. I'm sure he did say Israel's doing a great job. He's not about to criticize them.
No. Okay, it's just them talking. We can move on.
Welcome to the News Hour. A highly anticipated report from the State Department concludes that the U.S. may continue to send weapons to Israel despite apparent Israeli violations of international humanitarian law. The findings come just 2 days after the president said he would suspend shipment of 3,500 bombs to Israel as it now surges forces around Rafah in southern Gaza. The administration has said it opposes a full-scale ground invasion of Rafah city, where more than 1 million Gazans are sheltering. Here to walk through the details of this report at the end of this eventful week is our Nick Schifrin. So, Nick, tell us more about this report. What more did it say?
The National Security Memorandum number 20 that this report is based on requires the Department of State to obtain, quote, credible and reliable written assurances that Israel, as well as half a dozen other countries that gets U.S. weapons, are using those weapons in accordance of international humanitarian law and not restricting U.S. humanitarian assistance. The report is very critical, as you said, about the former aspect of that. Quote, it is reasonable to assess that defense articles covered under National Security Memorandum 20 have been used by Israeli security forces since October the 7th in instances inconsistent with its international humanitarian law obligations. It also says, while Israel has the knowledge, experience, and tools to implement best practices for mitigating civilian harm in its military operation, the results on the ground, including high levels of civilian casualties, raise substantial questions as to whether the IDF is using them effectively in all cases. The report is less critical on humanitarian aid, by the way. We do not currently assess that the Israeli government is prohibiting or otherwise restricting the transport or delivery of U.S. humanitarian assistance. But after all that, the report's bottom line is, as you said at the top, the U.S. could have cut off weapons to Israel based on this report, but it did not. The assessment there, quote, U.S. government currently assesses the assurances provided by each recipient country, again, Israel and half a dozen others, to be credible and reliable. That is the threshold for this report. so as to allow the provision of defense articles covered under NSM 20 to continue. In other words, the weapons will keep going.
As we mentioned, a highly anticipated report. So what kind of reaction are these findings now getting?
The report makes its final conclusion that Israel's weapons can continue to go, in part because of the nature of fighting Hamas and also what Israel has done internally. So Hamas, a terrorist organization, the U.S. describes it hiding in tunnels, hiding among the civilian population, and it describes how difficult of an environment of war that is for the Israeli Defense Forces. And it says there are IDF lawyers embedded in what it does and has taken steps to hold itself accountable, including criminal actions against certain officials. And that's the context that leads former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Dana Stroll to argue the report struck the right balance.
What this report is saying is that there are instances in which Israel has not achieved or lived up to its obligations, but it's also a professional military who has investigative processes and accountability mechanisms. And when many of the mistakes have been made over the course of the past 7 months, the Israel Defense Forces and the government of Israel have taken corrective measures to address the mistakes and move forward in a way that mitigates civilian harm.
My flashlight's been on.
But others are much more critical of Israel and of the report. They cite specific instances, including one that the report itself cites. There you see on the Jabalia refugee camp in October, the report says it killed dozens of children and wounded hundreds as an example of a violation of international humanitarian law. The argument there is that Israel should face consequences, says Charles Blaha, who's a former career Foreign Service officer who worked in the State Department's office that monitors if countries comply with international humanitarian law.
The government's report had said that. The government's report says things like it raises concerns, and there are acts that are inconsistent with international humanitarian law. That is a dodge. The conclusions that flow from what even the report says, but certainly from what the task force's report said, is that Israel has violated international humanitarian law in its use of U.S. origin items, and that should have been the clear assessment of the department's report.
And so now the debate will go on both about what Israel is doing and the report's conclusions. But again, the U.S. said tonight the weapons will continue.
Nick Schifrin with the latest on this late-breaking news today. Nick, thank you.
Thank you.
Chris Van Hollen had been pushing with other senators a letter reiterating to the president the Leahy.
What is this?
U.S. support for Israel weakens an international rules-based order.
I mean, how much
it's
majority
kind of what
report?
we just watched.
How much majority port do we want? You know.
I mean, we've had a few already. That's why I'm saying maybe we should just keep going.
We can move on.
The Israel-Hamas war continues. A huge explosion occurred in Gaza over the weekend. Israel sent tanks into eastern Jabalia in the northern Gaza Strip yesterday after a night of heavy aerial and ground bombardments. According to Gaza's health ministry, the death toll in Israel's military operation in Gaza has now reached at least 35,000 Palestinians. Israel says at least 620 soldiers have been killed in the fighting. Jabalia is the biggest of Gaza's 8 historic refugee camps, and it's home to more than 100,000.
The UN says that 300,000 people have now evacuated Rafah ahead of a promised Israeli invasion. On NBC's Meet the Press, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken told Kristen Welker that civilians are still at risk.
There has to be a credible plan for the civilians.
Have you seen a credible plan?
Sure. We have not.
Oh, we're going to look
at Claudia Lavanga, but first
we're going to look at that interview. So
Gaza are disturbing. Claudia, good morning.
Good morning, Francis. Well, according to the Palestinians on Sunday, there has been heavy Israeli bombardment and fighting in the north of Gaza, and the IDF has said that it killed several Hamas militants there, which is yet another proof that Hamas has managed to return and regroup into areas of Gaza that had previously been declared cleared by Israel since the start of the war. But a lot of focus and attention, of course, is still in the south of Gaza, in the town of Rafah, where many of the million Palestinians who are still finding shelter there, many of whom had to be moved there from other places yet.
Good. They're in the north again.
Well,
I guess
they
the IDF can stay in Gaza now.
Yay! Invasion, despite caused by many allies, including the United States, to hold fire. Now, another person now is calling for a ceasefire.
I feel less bad for Blinken now.
A former Israeli prime minister.
I think Blinken is finally being like, now I can finally stop holding it in. You know, he's getting a little bit of outlet now.
Yeah.
Because we're done. America is really signaling that it's done fucking around with Israel. Like,
yes, It really has, like,
and by that means it's going to be 8 months before anything serious happens.
Yeah. And Trump will be in power.
And then when it does happen, it will happen very suddenly and be very poorly done. You know, that's like the Afghan withdrawal, all of it.
Or it'll be done or it'll be done by Trump, and he'll rearm Israel and authorize a nuke to be dropped on Palestine.
Well, he can't do that.
Well, he'll try.
He'll send tomahawks, though.
Yeah, probably. But he doesn't need to drop one. Israel has them.
Yeah, I know, but he wouldn't. Nobody needs to authorize what Israel does with their nuclear arms.
No, I know, but I'm saying he would probably think he's that much of a king dipshit.
Well,
he has to authorize it.
Bro, let me tell you. I put it on the stream list.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was one of the last minute ads. Lindsey Graham is in there saying that they should drop a nuke on Gaza.
I think I added that, yes. Or I did say it, yes.
He wrote an opinion piece in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. Let me just quote you a part of it. Anyone who thinks that it's possible to return the hostages without a clear and total cessation of the war is deluding himself and the Israeli public. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is deliberately and knowingly foiling any chance of reaching such a deal. Very interesting to see important voices.
Yeah, no shit. He doesn't want the hostages. He could have had him back already.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and
Hamas
breaking
should
news
be
by
realizing
downloading
right
the
now
NBC
that they
News
should
app.
just release the hostages because holding them is just an excuse for Israel to go. They're not going to get a deal
The United
with Israel.
Nations says
Just
that more than
release them, right?
360,000
Yeah.
Then where is going to be Israel's excuse to continue? They could fuck Netanyahu over by doing that. I mean, it's kind of the only chip they have left. The hostages haven't worked. The fucking terrorist government, and I say that literally because look, if you watch their terrorist terrorism, we show that 2 terrorist factions are actually in charge of Israel right now.
Gazans who fled to Rafah have now been forced to flee again as Israeli troops attack sectors of the city in a bid to rout
she's
Hamas.
got her commie
Also in Rafah today, the
clothes
first
on
foreign
today.
UN staffer was killed by Israeli troops. More than 100 Palestinian UN staff have been killed since
all
October
she's
7th.
missing is the
Nick
Red
Schiffer
Guard
has
hat.
our report.
A city that's been teeming with the displaced is now slowly being deserted. A quarter of the 1.3 million Gazans who fled here are now packing everything their cars or bikes can carry and fleeing again. Fatah Ahmed is among the last to leave.
I don't have a choice, like everyone else. Everyone left, so I am doing the same. What should I do? Stay alone? I am scared to stay alone.
Many have been displaced to what is essentially the beach, piling their lives upon a pile of sand. Meet the Zatar family. This is their third home, as it were, since the war began. The children have kept their smile, but their mother Amina's has vanished.
I can't find a tent to set up for me and my children. They are suffering underneath the sun.
How old are you?
Burnt them, and they are ill.
I thought she was the
Israel's ordering
older
Rafah evacuated
sister.
because the IDF says Hamas's final 4 battalions fight from there, including with mortars last weekend that killed 4 Israeli soldiers. And
Was this the really young lady with the 3 kids on the beach?
Yeah, she
looks super young, right?
I was like looking at her like she was a child.
Yeah, that's what I thought when she popped up in the news wrap earlier.
block humanitarian aid.
Let's make it clear: if we don't destroy the last 4 battalions,
I love
Hamas
this 4
in Rafah,
battalions thing that
we
they're
would have lost the war.
bringing up now.
Now Israel has launched
and,
new
and
raids on what it
remember,
calls Hamas terrorist
I just want to
infrastructure
point
in
out, I
central and northern
said
Gaza,
a while
areas where
back
Israel long ago cleared.
that
What we're
if
seeing is a kind of sorcerer's
they start
apprentice type
clamping
dynamic.
down
The units devolved into
and trying to
small
silence
unilities,
them.
and they don't require any centralized.
Waiting for the pause here so
Retired
I can
Brigadier
talk.
General Yonatan Shimsoni had a 50-year career in the military.
Sorry, man, I'm coming back and forth.
Anyway, I forgot what I was going to say now.
Someone will remind, because I did have it, but as soon as you said I forgot as well. This doesn't help.
Anyway,
I can go back.
months ago, I was saying
battalion.
That when they scale down, they're going to do the same thing that they said about Afghanistan, where it's like, oh, we almost had them, but then they drew down the forces and they focused on Iraq.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. We only had 4 left, and then the Americans stopped us, and now they're going to reproduce and be like ISIS in the future.
Yeah, that's.
Okay,
I
bro.
think you've nailed it. That's exactly the narrative they're going to go with.
Central and northern Gaza areas. Retired Brigadier General Yonatan Shimsoni had a 50-year career in the military and is now with Commanders for Israel's Security. He says in central and northern Gaza, Hamas is able to reconstitute because there is no one there to stop them.
Israel has not created an alternative, so there is no alternative there.
I created an
Hamas is
alternative.
exploiting
Okay.
the vacuum.
An
Today, National Security
occupational
Advisor Jake
government.
Sullivan said Israel must look beyond individual military victories to find a political strategy.
There needs to be more attention on that piece of it, lest we end up in a circumstance where
It's
Israel
crazy how we got
conducts a
like
military operation, kills a bunch
Jared
of Hamas
Kushner
guys,
2.0
also
in this
creates some harm
advent.
to innocent civilians caught in the crossfire, and then terrorists come back, as we have seen them come back in Gaza City and Khan Yunis and other places. We want to avoid that outcome.
The army has been saying for months now, tell us what it is that you really want to achieve in Gaza. I mean, what is the political, diplomatic outcome that you envision so we know what to pursue? So as the Cheshire Cat said, if you don't tell me where you want to go, I can't tell you how to get there.
But those strategic debates feel detached from the trauma. Today is Israel's Memorial Day, more raw than ever, especially at the site of the worst single attack of the worst terrorist attack in the country's history, the Nova Music Festival.
Said, the sky is crying with us. The rain was all around. I feel very, very, very sad. Very sad.
Well,
what
it
happened
depends. I'll say that it depends on what they mean by battalions.
Today, Prime Minister
because
Benjamin
I've said
Netanyahu
multiple
said the
times
soldiers who
that like
died fighting
Hamas
died for an
has like
existential
interfactions, and if they're talking about these interfactions
It's us or
and
them.
stuff, maybe.
Israel or the monsters
But
of
like,
Hamas.
yeah, it's
It's
bullshit.
existence, freedom, security, and prosperity, or annihilation, massacre, rape, and enslavement. We are determined to win this fight, but the price we are paying and that generations before us paid is heavy.
The war is heavy for everyone looking for light to pierce the darkness. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Nick Schifrin.
For more on the strained relationship between the U.S. and Israel, I want to bring in Weijia Jiang. So, Weijia, let's talk about this. Secretary of
We
State
never had
Antony
to make
Blinken and National Security
excuses in the
Advisor
war
Jake Sullivan,
against
they both
ISIS.
spoke to their Israeli counterparts yesterday. This is despite some
because it's
pretty
ISIS.
overt criticism of Israelis' actions in Gaza. I guess the good news is they're talking. What is the nature of the communication between the two governments?
Well, Anne-Marie, since October 7th, the two governments really have not stopped talking, and that includes constant communication between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu as well. In fact, they just spoke by phone exactly 1 week ago. And certainly, while these conversations have grown tense at times, the U.S. has not really changed its policy with regard to fully supporting Israel, even though there are warnings on the table. And Secretary Blinken, Jake Sullivan, will continue to talk about what the U.S. would like to see in terms of a ceasefire to get a hostage deal, in terms of how they believe this should end. They do keep talking, and I think that is what's critical here, Anne-Marie. And it's not just these two principals, but also their staffs below them. They're in constant communication with their Israeli counterparts.
So, we talked about kind of overt criticism in a way that we haven't heard before. Part of it happened over the weekend on Face the Nation. Secretary Blinken was on Face the Nation yesterday, and he spoke about Israel's war efforts. Here's what he had to say.
Oh,
when
well,
it comes to the use of weapons.
We should have watched
concerns
this
about
before. They keep
incidents
referencing
where,
this clip.
Given the totality.
They're going to keep referencing this Blinken clip until we watch it. It's a good interview. I listened to the whole thing, actually. It wasn't just a screen. Like the Tom Cotton interview, I couldn't sit through.
I don't think that I put it on there because I
it.
had so much coverage of it. I just assumed that there would
if
be
there's
coverage.
enough coverage of it, then fuck it. Yeah.
I just assumed that there'd be enough
Honestly,
coverage of
think
it that I
it's
wouldn't grab the
an
full
interview
thing.
worth watching because there's lots of comment on what he says.
Okay. How long is it?
I'll get it.
We've got a lot of coverage of this already. That's all.
Let me tell you. It is his interview and is it Face the Nation? 10 months ago. 6 months ago.
They both are.
I don't see it. They already have shorts of the Queen. Here we go. It's 8 minutes. So it's pretty short. Because I think it's like, honestly, like most of the stuff, most of the news, I mean, besides the Ukraine stuff, but like most of the domestic US news is not too interesting. But there is,
We are learning more
Trump said some really funny shit at a rally.
about the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza as thousands are fleeing what was once a safe zone, the southern city of Rafah. The challenges facing the Biden
It's crazy. It looks
administration from a
nothing
diplomatic
like
standpoint
Syria.
continue to grow too. Although the U.S. supports Israel's right to retaliate against Hamas for the brutal October 7th attack that killed more than 1,200 people, there are deep concerns about the Palestinian death toll, as even Prime Minister Netanyahu conceded that his forces have in fact killed more civilians than members of Hamas. We begin this morning with Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who joins us from the State Department. Good morning, Mr. Secretary. I know military experts say Gaza is as complicated and challenging a battlefield as any modern warfare has seen. But back in December, President Biden said Israel conducted indiscriminate bombing. In February, he said Israel's offensive was over the top. And then this past week,
Oh,
he was asked
remember
on
that?
CNN
Remember
about
that,
pausing the
guys?
delivery of 3,500 bombs. Here's what he said.
Civilians have been killed in Gaza as a consequence of those bombs and other ways in which they go after population centers. I made it clear that if they go into Rafah,
Civilians were killed, and that's what we're going to continue to try to do.
Deal with Rafah, to deal with the cities, to deal with that problem.
Mr. Secretary, is Israel living up to international humanitarian law standards?
Well, first, Mark, good morning. The report
I love that when they
we
do
put
that.
out,
Well, first of
lays
all,
out some of the
that's how you
concerns
know
that
they're
we've
going to
had
dodge the question.
throughout this period when it comes to humanitarian assistance, particularly the early months after October 7th, and when it comes to the use of weapons, concerns about incidents where, given the totality of the damage that's been done to children, women, men, it was reasonable to assess that in certain instances, Israel acted in ways that are not consistent with international humanitarian law. It's also critical to note that Israel itself has accountability processes to get at this. There are hundreds of ongoing inquiries looking at different incidents that have taken place since October 7th. There are criminal investigations that are going forward. Unlike most other countries in the world, Israel has the ability, the means, and the actions to self-correct. But we've been on this every single day.
So you have been able then to conclude that Israel has violated U.S. laws and weapon sharing agreements?
No, what we've concluded is in the case of the use of weapons, as you said, this is an extraordinarily complex military environment in which you have an enemy, Hamas, that committed the most atrocious terrorist attacks on Israel on October 7th, and then retreats to Gaza, hides behind and underneath civilians in hospitals, schools, mosques, apartment buildings. And that makes it very difficult to determine, particularly in the midst of war, exactly what happened and to draw any final conclusions from any one incident. So
I love it
we
because
have a number of incidents that we continue to look at.
Like in the Iraq War, they would say this, like, "Oh, the terrorists are hiding behind civilians." Meanwhile, the big incident that caused Iraq to really go downhill was Marines occupying a fucking school.
Was it really?
Yeah, because that's where the protests in Fallujah start from.
Okay.
And so, like, there's multiple sides to the story, but basically, we could say that somebody threw a rock, maybe somebody shot a gun, maybe somebody confused something for a gun being shot. But there was 2 different protests where the Marines opened fired on civilians within like weeks of each other. And like, you can only find this on, I've only found this on like Web Archive reporting on this, because it was just like, it was just so early that it wasn't like stuff being posted online. So like the sites that hosted it, it's like very hard to find like early news from that era. It's a weird transition era.
Very strange.
To try to get the best possible assessment. The Israelis themselves are doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Our assessments will be ongoing. But
They
as I
made a
said, given the
documentary
totality
about it,
of
I think.
what we've seen in terms
The
of
school
civilian suffering,
occupation
in terms of children, women, men caught in this crossfire Hamas is making, who've been killed or been injured, it's reasonable to assess that in a number of instances, Israel has not acted in a manner that's consistent with international humanitarian law.
And I think the
So I understand you're
documentary
still
is like
collecting
done by the
evidence.
guy who embedded with Zarqawi. But
What
also,
was that?
I think the documentary is also like, it's the documentary on this school occupation is also like from the guy who embedded with Zarqawi's forces. So he
Okay.
he also films the not technically, he gets some of the He films the outside of the building where the guy gets the Medal of Honor in Fallujah because he like beats a guy to death with his plate and like kills him with a utility knife.
Interesting.
He clears a whole house. He clears a whole house
with a utility knife.
Well, he does. It just ends in a hand-to-hand combat.
Okay.
And they're like trying to kill each other, but he cleared a whole house on his own, and he got a Medal of Honor for it.
Interesting.
But the journalist was there as well. Like, see, look at how archived this shit is. U.S. troops leave school after deadly clash with Iraqis. Soldiers acted in self-defense, is what Central Command says. They pulled out of a school 40 miles. See, there is reporting on it, but see how, like, that's some old internet shit. It doesn't even have support, you know?
Jesus Christ.
But on the policy, can you clarify? Because even the lead Democrat on House Armed Services says it's not clear. Is the U.S. slowing down the delivery of any weapons to Israel at this point beyond the 3,500 so-called dumb bombs?
As you know, Margaret, most of the population from Gaza displaced from the north and from central Gaza has gone to Rafah. There are about 1.4 million people there. And we've said to Israel that we will not support an operation in Rafah, a major military operation, in the absence of a credible plan to protect civilians.
And they still haven't delivered it. So are you slowing the delivery of any weapons beyond these 3,500 bombs? Are you pausing, for example, precision munitions, as some Republicans have
the
claimed?
The answer to that is no. What the president said and what he's been clear about in private conversations with the Israelis, which unfortunately leaked to the press, so the president responded forthrightly when he was asked about it. But what we've been clear about is that if Israel launches this major military operation into Rafah, then there are certain systems that we're not going to be supporting and supplying for that operation. But at present, the only thing that we've delayed and are holding back are these high payload bombs, because we're in an ongoing conversation with Israel, given the impact that those weapons can have when they're used in densely populated areas, including an area like Rafah. So we're in an active conversation with Israel about that. We have real concerns about the way they're used. But here's something else that's critically important, Margaret. We believe two things. One, you have to have a clear, credible plan to protect civilians, which we haven't seen. Second, we also need to see a plan for what happens after this conflict in Gaza is over. And we still haven't seen that, because what are we seeing right now? We're seeing parts of Gaza that Israel has cleared of Hamas, where Hamas is coming back, including in the north, including in Khan Yunis. As we look at Rafah, they may go in and have some initial success, but potentially at an incredibly high cost to civilians, but one that is not durable, one that's not sustainable. And they will be left holding the bag on an enduring insurgency, because a lot of armed Hamas will be left, no matter what they do in Rafah. Or if they leave and get out of Gaza, as we believe they need to do, then you're going to have a vacuum, and a vacuum that's likely to be filled by chaos, by anarchy, and ultimately by Hamas again. So
anarchy would be better.
Many weeks on developing credible plans for security, for governance, for rebuilding.
But we know that you
haven't
don't
seen that come
mean
from Israel.
actual
We've been,
anarchy.
working with Arab countries and others on that plan. We need to see that too. We have the same objective as Israel. We want to make sure that Hamas cannot govern Gaza again. We want to make sure it's demilitarized. We want to make sure that Israel gets its leaders. That's what we're determined to do. We have a different way, and we think a more effective, durable way of getting that done. We remain in conversation with Israel about exactly that.
Mr. Secretary, your national security memorandum that you signed says Israeli civilian harm mitigation efforts are, quote, inconsistent, ineffective, and inadequate. The prime minister himself said Israel assesses the IDF killed 14,000 terrorists and 16,000 civilians.
Nice.
Does the U.S. share the Israeli assessment that more civilians have been killed than actual terrorists?
Yes, we do. And I think the report makes clear that while Israel has processes, procedures, rules, regulations to try to minimize civilian harm, given the impact that this operation, this war in Gaza has had on the civilian population.
And yet you're still surging
those
weapons
have not
to Israel.
been those have not been applied consistently and effectively. There's a gap between the stated intent and some of the
our
results
official
we've seen, but
stance is
because it's so complicated.
In
the midst of a war,
glitching out.
and
Our
particularly
official
in the midst of a
stance
war,
is
where you
that
have an enemy
America
that
should
hides
leave
in-
Iraq entirely. You know, our official stance is that America should have left Afghanistan entirely. You know, that's always our official stance. We say occupation, permanent occupation, is wrong. You know, yeah. Our official stance is world peace good. Yeah, we're the peacekeepers and the peacemakers.
Civilian infrastructure, hides behind civilians to make final determinations on these individual incidents. We're looking at the totality of what's happened. We think it's reasonable to assess, based on what's happened, that there have been acts that have been inconsistent with Israel's obligations under international humanitarian law, but we haven't drawn definitive conclusions. We need to pursue these investigations, just as Israel is doing itself.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for your time this morning.
What's his role? Secretary of State?
Yeah.
Yeah, Israeli Secretary of State?
Yeah, anyway, so this documentary I was thinking of, if you want to see the best documentary on the Iraq War, you can literally find this on YouTube. It's called Only the Dead. Australian journalist Michael Ware experiences Iraq in the 2003 war and after. As you can see, there's 2 credits, the narrator and Abu Sakawi. This documentary is so good because it actually shows the insurgents' perspective.
Interesting.
And it shows like how Iraq falls into chaos under Zarqawi. And Zarqawi actually sent this journalist a tape and was like, I want you to be the voice of the insurgency, right? And like they capture him. They're about to cut his head off and shit, right? And like Zarqawi makes the call that we can use this guy because he had already been embedded with the IAI. He films them mortaring an American base in this documentary. But like he's released several documentaries of the footage he's had in Iraq. This one is just the best.
So Zarqawi freed him.
Yeah,
so
he didn't personally meet Zarqawi face to face though.
That's disappointing.
It's played up like that in the trailer, but it still is like it still shows the insurgent perspective, and it's a Western documentary though. So that's why I think it's really good. Yeah, because it's the other one is like the war you don't see, and it's just about like Fallujah conspiracies and shit.
Yeah.
Senator Tom Cotton. Senator, welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
You just heard Secretary Blinken explain the administration's policy. He says Hamas absolutely does not abide by international law. Israel is inconsistent with international humanitarian law, but he stopped short of saying they're violating weapons sharing agreements. Does this make sense to you?
No, it doesn't make any sense at all, Margaret. It sounded like a bunch of Weasley, mealy-mouth politics. He said it's reasonable to assess. He said that like 3 or 4 times. It's like he was coached to say that as if it was some magic talisman to help them walk the political line they want between the pro-Hamas Labour Party.
No offense, but it sounds like some fucking commie gobbledygook.
Oh, it's rehearsed. No, you think? Oh, I fucking hate these people so much.
Pro-Israel majority of the American people. The report that they put out Friday night after news deadlines passed was very clear. There is no evidence that Israel is violating international law.
Oh, really?
All civilian casualties in Gaza are solely the responsibility of Hamas. In fact, Israel is probably doing more than any military in history to avoid civilian casualties.
No.
Well, actually, it says the U.S. intelligence.
No. Definitely not. Because they don't even come close to like the Americans. You know, not all years. There's a few specific really, really bad years of the Iraq War, mainly the early ones.
This community notes security forces in Israel have inflicted harm on civilians in military or security operations, potentially using U.S.-provided equipment. U.S. assesses Israel could do more to avoid civilian harm. So it doesn't say they're not doing it. It says they can't, for some reason, come to a clear conclusion.
Secretary Blinken's own report says there's no evidence that they can't reach that conclusion. Ben Cardin, the senior Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, agrees that the report says there is no evidence. In fact, he also says that Joe Biden was wrong to impose this de facto arms embargo on Israel. Again, Israel is doing more than any military in history in all likelihood to prevent civilian casualties. If Hamas did not hide behind and under civilians, there would not be civilian casualties. For that matter, if Hamas simply surrendered and turned over all these hostages, there would be no more civilian suffering in Gaza.
Which is what President Biden says as well.
Doesn't have civilian casualties. I don't care how conventional that shit is. Get real.
I know you're a lawyer. You went to Harvard Law. You were an army officer. You deployed to Iraq. You deployed to Afghanistan. It has to trouble you when the Israeli prime minister says himself that they...
You know, you could call it a war. You know, ethical, precise, just. Still, civilians were killed.
Not to the extent that Israel is doing it.
Yes,
though.
but
That's
still, what is that? Oh, if this Hamas wasn't hiding behind civilians, there would be no civilian casualties.
Killed more civilians than terrorists. Thousands more civilians than terrorists.
It troubles me deeply that Hamas is using those civilians as human shields because that is their strategy. Remember,
So
Margaret,
should U.S. But to that point though, because the United States provides billions of dollars in weapons to Israel, should it have a say in how those weapons are used? Because the needle Blinken seemed to be
that's what the deal is.
It was very specifically tailored in terms of withholding these large
the
bombs.
Thing that pisses me off the most
bombs.
is how high of a standard we're holding Ukraine to, right? Like with their shit, right? Like, nobody, Ukraine is underneath a fucking magnifying glass.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know why? Because Russia has enough to actually be a threat to hegemony. Hamas doesn't. That's why they don't care.
Yeah.
Also because it's fucking Israel.
Yeah, I feel like it's more that it's Israel. More than anything else.
Didn't really care about Saudi Arabia either. They still don't, them killing the fucking civilians on the border.
But also similar reasoning to Israel.
Well, the reason Israel needs these larger bombs is because Hamas has buried tunnels where they're holding hostages and where its leaders are holed up.
Big bombs do not mean deeper explosions. That's not how it works.
Idiot. What an actual
You need
moron.
like precision, like things that like bunker bust are like Sabat
missiles.
Stuff, like things that like have a shell and then separate that shell a few times, and then like a little needle hits the ground and pierces all the way through.
Mm-hmm. That's it. Big bomb make big bang.
Also, at this point, chemical weapons would be better.
Yes.
Than like the shit that Israel is doing.
Especially for urban warfare, chemical weapons would
like
fuck
at this
shit
point,
up.
like fucking just throw some chlorine tablets in there. But,
it would never aerosolize because there's no water.
Well, you throw in pool filters in there.
Delaying the kits that allow these so-called dumb bombs to become smart precision bombs.
Because I haven't looked into this enough, but I wonder how their airflow is. Like they have to have vents and stuff.
Yeah, I would imagine so. Building codes still exist. They kind
of these are the underground tunnels, though.
Oh, yeah, I would imagine that they probably have like pipes and shit stuck.
And that's another thing is like Israel will undermine, right, and like plant charges throughout an entire tunnel and then level a whole block.
Yes.
To destroy the tunnel.
Yeah. It's insane.
And apparently, based on reports this morning, the administration even says they're withholding intelligence about the location of senior
civilians were moved beforehand.
Say it again.
I would care less about it if we can guarantee every time the underminings happen that bulldoze buildings if the civilians were moved. I would care. Like, it's still fucked up, but I would care a lot less as long as like civilians aren't in the fucking crossfire. Like losing your home is different than losing your life,
leaders and therefore hostages, to include potentially American hostages, from Israel to try to force Israel not to go into Rafah.
The White House denies that, and John Kirby briefed the other day that the U.S. is sharing intelligence.
That's the thing, though, is ISIS literally did, and Netanyahu literally cites the Battle of Mosul, right? He says Iraq and Mosul, they had like some shitty statistic, like 1 to 2 like civilian deaths, and it's like, congratulations, the most sophisticated army is comparing themselves to the Iraqi army that literally was just formed. Like when they couldn't even do they were supposed to lead the operation against Sadr, right? And they don't. So that same army is the one that gets hit by ISIS, crumbles, and then they have to reform it. It's like literally a brand new army that you're sending in to fight ISIS, right? And it's like the Americans really were hanging back. Like they were strategic advisors and stuff, but that shit was won by Iraq. And then like to sit there and like literally what like the movie Mosul shows it very well. Like when ISIS was cornered, they would send out civilians and be shooting the civilians from behind, like with snipers as they were like pushing out and pushing civilians towards you. They would corral the civilians and then like shoot them to make them run. So like, you want to talk about human shields. ISIS definitely did it, but still nobody was crying. They were going, they saw the white phosphorus and like freaked out about it. And the Americans were like, yep, that was all us. Nobody did any orders to order this white phosphorus. Nobody called for it but us.
Who has not been killed in the 7 months of this war.
It was in the Washington Post with 4 officials familiar with it. The Washington Post is like the message board for this administration and the Democratic Party.
You believe that the intelligence community is withholding information?
I believe that Joe Biden is willing to do that. I mean, he's
Do you have any evidence?
All the time.
Like every fucking day,
Mm.
instead of being the president.
Mm-hmm.
He's imposed a de facto arms embargo on Israel and sanctions on Israelis.
They're
in the
sending
meantime,
weapons this weekend. It's an arms embargo.
He just said last week that he's not going to send offensive weapons. We have no idea what he's going to withhold.
That was, as we just exchanged with Secretary Blinken, not a very clear statement in that CNN interview. Democrats have said that. But what Blinken said there was it was just that one single shipment. You're saying you do not believe the Secretary of State when he says that?
Margaret, in March of 2022, Tony Blinken came on your show, this very show, and said the United States would be perfectly fine to see fighter jets sent to Ukraine. Joe Biden immediately reversed Tony Blinken's statement on this show. So what Tony Blinken says on this show cannot be credited when Joe Biden is out there imposing a de facto arms embargo on Israel at the same time he's letting arms embargoes on Iran expire.
You know, $26 billion in emergency funding was just approved by the president.
Okay.
And there is not an arms embargo
Letting
on
arms
Israel. And there's
embargo
not
on
a block on
Iran
intelligence
expire.
sharing with
Okay.
Israel. You know that.
Joe Biden said last week that he's going to stop supplying offensive weapons that can be used in an urban setting. That is the only
If they
setting
go
in
into
Gaza. That is the only setting in Gaza. And they have to go into Rafah. Joe Biden's position is
Does this guy represent Israel? He's a senator for
Hey, you
Jerusalem?
can't say that. That's what the new law says. You can't say that somebody likes Israel more than America.
I'm not American.
I know. That's not what the law actually says. I mean, it kind of does. But...
I don't give a shit. Fuck this guy. This guy's got
I know,
Israel's
right?
boots so far down his throat, I can hear him gagging.
Well, also,
while
they
he
can use
talks.
it as a political hanging to criticize Biden.
Sure.
That's the main thing that's going on here.
de facto for a Hamas victory at this point. Israel's goal is to destroy.
Look, he's so in favor of Israel, he's changed his tie color from red to blue.
Destroy Hamas, which committed the worst
or
atrocity
is he
against
a
Jews
Democrat
since
now?
World War II.
No,
Hamas's
he's
goal
like-
is to survive.
he's a Tom-Tom
If Israel does not go into Rafah and destroy Hamas in Rafah, Hamas will survive.
Well, the Biden administration says they can go into Rafah. It's how they do it. But I want to ask you more broadly, because people like Senator Van Hollen, who's going to be on here, will talk about the principle and the spirit and the meaning of U.S. law. And you know that past presidents have withheld military aid to Israel to force changes in behavior.
Yeah, like
President
Reagan.
did that.
Thank
President
you.
Bush did that. Why do you have a problem with President Biden doing it?
Well, first off, when you talk about the principle and the
Because he's a
spirit,
Democrat and Reagan and
Yeah.
Bush were Republicans. I'm Tom Cotton. Guess how I got my
Of
name?
US
Team fucking.
Guess where the
team
name
sport.
Cotton comes from?
law, it sounds to me like they're not talking about the letter of U.S.
I'm
law
Tom
because Tony
Slave
Blinken's
Owner
own report concluded
for
they do not
US
violate
Senate.
U.S. law. Ronald Reagan's decision to pause the delivery of fighter jets in the 1980s was totally different from what happened here. Israel is fighting a war of survival against a terrorist group that committed the worst
Oh
atrocity
my
against Jews since World War
God.
II. In the
Israel is
1980s,
fighting
an Israeli
a war of
ambassador had been targeted for
survival.
assassination. Ronald Reagan knew that the pause of fighter jets would not interfere with Israel's fighting because they had plenty of fighters. He did not pause munitions. Joe Biden is not sending munitions in the middle of a shooting war that's a war of survival. And look at the broader
A shooting war? Who's shooting? Oh, Israel shooting? Who's shooting
it's a
back?
matter
Nobody?
of survival.
Mm,
A matter of survival. Why? Because Hamas said they'll do it again. Okay.
Fucking do it again.
context.
Maybe
Israel
don't
knew
let
that Ronald
them
Reagan had
next
it.
time. You know who
Yeah.
else said that? Al-Qaeda. I mean, ISIS did several attacks. They said it too.
Mm.
Maybe Hamas should
back
be
in the
more like
region.
ISIS.
He sank half of Iran's navy. Joe Biden has consistently given
yeah.
Iran hundreds of billions of dollars of sanctions relief that exactly funded groups like
And
Hamas
you
and
know
Hezbollah.
they dispute that, and they are still sending weapons. But last month, Donald Trump told Time Magazine, Bibi Netanyahu
Lying.
rightfully has been criticized for what took place on October 7th. Do you agree with that assessment? Are you comfortable with any criticism of the prime minister?
Look, I think Prime Minister Netanyahu and other senior Israeli leaders have acknowledged they have responsibility for the failures on October 7th. And they've said, as is the Israeli custom, when this war is over, there'll probably be a commission of inquiry to
What
figure out
about
exactly
9/11?
what went wrong to ensure it doesn't happen again. But President Trump said just last night that he would absolutely
What's up,
provide
Beijing?
Israel with the weapons they need to finish the job. This would have
Mm-hmm.
never happened on President Trump's watch. It didn't happen on his watch. And if he were president, this war would have probably already been over with much less civilian suffering in Gaza because he would have backed Israel to the hilt from the beginning.
Uh-huh.
Well, That's a
okay,
debate on
bro.
counterfactuals for another day, Senator, but it's good to have you here in person. Thank you for your time. We'll be right back.
That's her saying you're a fucking moron. I'm glad you're leaving. Bye.
Are you aware of a CIA psychological profile about you, sir? Would you be interested in hearing what the CIA had to say? This secret study portrays as a brilliant but dangerous megalomaniac who is likely to pursue his own aims in disregard of U.S. interests. He's an uncertain ally. Shall I go on, or would you prefer that I stop, sir?